Dragon Quest Builders first arrived on PlayStation platforms late last year, but now the title is heading towards a Nintendo Switch, and at the moment there's a demo available on the Nintendo eShop, so we thought we'd take a look to see how this title holds up on Nintendo's platform. Compared to previous Dragon Quest titles, what we have here isn't a JRPG at all. Instead, it's more like a Japanese take on Minecraft. The game focuses on real-time gameplay, where you're running around hacking and slashing at both enemies and the environment, collecting resources in the process. These can then be used to construct various elements from weapons, clothing, furniture, to even buildings themselves. You're using your resources to construct a town, inviting various NPCs to join, building it up as you go. It's an alternative take on the likes of Minecraft that's easier to get to grips with and that has a little bit more structure. It's also exactly the kind of experience that is perfectly suited to Nintendo Switch. In this case, the game's fairly generous save system means that you don't need to play for long periods of time to enjoy the title, and the simplistic but cute, colourful visuals also stand out enough to work quite well on the small screen as well. So it's a great little title, but how does it fare on Nintendo's platform? One of the most striking aspects of the presentation is that the game is targeting 60 frames per second in docked mode, something you don't really see that often on titles that have been ported over from PS4 to Switch, such as I'm Setsuna for example, which downgraded its frame rate to 30 FPS, though visual quality and resolution match PS4. In Dragon Quest Builders, what we're seeing is a different approach. Resolution is lowered from 1080p on PS4 down to 720p on the Switch, but visual quality is otherwise mostly identical. Here it's clear that the developer is favouring performance over pixel counts, and I think this is a pretty good choice. Sure, the 720p resolution looks softer and less refined on a HD TV compared to the PS4 game, but the simplistic nature of the visuals means that I think the presentation still looks reasonably good. I mean, the visuals do appear slightly fuzzier and softer on the Switch, but the lack of high frequency detail definitely means that the upscaling isn't as noticeable compared to on more complex titles. And I actually feel that the increase in smoothness by running at 60 FPS instead of 30 actually benefits the experience. The game mostly looks and plays very smoothly, something that is a lot easier to do when running at higher frame rates. Aside from resolution, most of the presentation is basically a match. Shadow quality is dialed back a tad on the Switch, with these elements being a little bit less defined on PS4, but aside from that, essentially the core assets and effects work are very closely matched across the two platforms. Resolution aside, there are really only minor differences between PS4 and Switch here, and I get the feeling that Square Enix really wanted to replicate the same standard of visual quality on Nintendo's platform, in this case though, paring back resolution to maintain 60 frames per second. I think it works quite well, although it would be nice to see a 1080p native mode, but perhaps with a 30 FPS cap, something that would probably hold up better on a full HD screen, but as it stands, I quite like that the game is running at 60 frames per second for the additional smoothness. But that said, just how close does the game actually get to hitting that desired 60 FPS refresh? Are we looking at a game that truly runs at 60 frames per second, or just a title which has an uncapped frame rate that goes higher than the usual 30 FPS we expect? Well, here's a look at the game running on Nintendo Switch in the docked mode. And yeah, generally performance is very stable for most of the time throughout the demo. Large parts of the game do indeed operate at a faultless 60 frames per second, where the game appears very smooth and controller response feels rather crisp. Pretty much what you expect from a game running at this frame rate. It's not an absolute lock at 60 frames per second, and there are a few drops that occur from time to time, resulting in some additional stutter on screen. The results generally aren't too bad though, and for the most part you're getting a mostly smooth and consistent experience. It's only really when moving into more complex territory, where complex scenery and an increased abundance of foliage and alpha effects tends to hit frame rates a little bit harder. These drops are only momentary though, and it's not long before the action goes back up to the desired 60 FPS. The only strange thing I noticed is that sometimes the experience doesn't feel that smooth when panning the camera. Frame rates here are actually solid according to our tools, every frame is unique, but at the same time there's something about the panning motion that doesn't feel quite as smooth as it should do, almost as if we're seeing certain frames being missing, even though the game is displaying unique frames back to back here. is something that affects the PS4 version as well, not just the Nintendo Switch release. So maybe we're just looking at an oddity to do with how the renderer is actually outputting frames to the screen. It's not a major issue, but it is a little weird to see when usually camera panning is very smooth with a 60 FPS game. The results on Nintendo's platform are generally quite good, and really hold up very well when compared to the PlayStation 4 version. PS4 is operating at 1080p and once again targeting 60 frames per second, and it does a reasonable job at holding that, although surprisingly performance here isn't quite perfect. This is a fairly simple game, and you'd expect that frame rates would be pretty much locked to 60 FPS, but while moving around the landscape and hacking away the environment, I did notice a few similar performance drops to the Nintendo Switch here, where frame rates weren't always hitting 60 frames per second. In fact, at times performance actually stutters a little bit more on the PS4, with more frequent drops to the frame rate. Now none of this is particularly intrusive, but it's kind of weird to see that performance is faltering at all here. At the same time, I don't really feel that it affects the gameplay experience hugely. I mean, this isn't the kind of game that requires ultra crisp controls, and it's not a particularly fast-paced title. So the drops in frame rate translate to more of the occasional sort of stutter from time to time, but the impact is very limited, and I generally feel that gameplay comes away completely unscathed here. What's surprising though is just how well the Nintendo Switch actually holds up. Yeah, resolution is dropped to 720p, but in terms of performance, it's very similar to the PlayStation 4 all round, and that's pretty cool, seeing the games running almost at identical levels of frame rate and smoothness, and yet on the Switch, there's also the possibility to play in portable mode as well. Docked mode holds up really well on the platform, and I think it's a highly enjoyable game to play there. But what about when taking the Switch on the go? Well, in this case, the setup is somewhat more interesting. In terms of the baseline visual quality, resolution actually comes in at 720p. That doesn't change compared to docked mode, and the graphical settings also appear very closely matched as well. For the most part, we're looking at exactly the same presentation when running portable or docked. It's just the shadow draw distances that get pared back a touch. So I think the game generally holds up very well on the Switch's screen, with the image being a perfect one-to-one pixel map to the handheld's display, giving us a crisp, clear image. The big difference here though is in terms of performance. While docked, the game is targeting 60 frames per second. In portable mode, the game immediately drops down to 30 FPS instead. In fact, for the first couple of minutes of the game, it was solidly locked at 30 frames per second, so I assumed that we were looking at a 30 FPS cap here. The game actually plays very well despite the drop in frame rate, and I think that playing on the small screen means that the reduced level of smoothness isn't quite so obvious. Coupled with the fact that it's quite a slow-paced game where you're more focused on building rather than fighting, and I think it plays really well at 30 FPS on the small screen. Curiously, performance in portable mode is actually unlocked. Looking down at the floor or sky at certain points in the environment, less demanding areas I think, sees the frame rate go up to 60 frames per second momentarily, but as soon as you start looking up, it comes crashing down to 30 FPS again. Unfortunately, we aren't able to capture direct portable feed, and that means that we can't run the footage for our analysis tools, but by eye it's pretty clear. The game occasionally can hit 60 frames per second in very rare moments, but most of the time during regular gameplay just running around playing the game as you're supposed to, it's pretty much a locked 30 frames per second here. Either way, I think that the experience still holds up very well on portable mode, and it's kind of an interesting choice really, targeting high frame rates when docked in order to match the PS4 experience in that area, but then cutting back on the frame rate in portable mode but keeping the resolution and visual settings on a par with when docked. I think it works quite well actually, and I'd kind of prefer it to had they dropped the resolution in order to hit 60 FPS when running in portable mode. Although perhaps a 1080p 30 docked option would have also been pretty cool to see for those that wanted to prioritize image quality over performance. So I think the game holds up very well on the Nintendo Switch and is definitely worth checking out if you're looking for another enjoyable game for Nintendo's hybrid console. Okay, so that's the Switch and PS4 versions, but what about PS4 Pro? Before we go, I thought I'd check this out because there's been a lot of confusion as to whether the game actually supports PS4 Pro at all, and from what I've seen it looks like Pro support is actually absent here. Switching to PS4 Pro and the resolution stays at native 1080p, and in terms of performance we're still seeing similar drops to on base hardware, suggesting that the Pro isn't really being used at all. Graphical quality is also identical to PS4, so if there is genuine Pro support here, it's certainly not looking obvious. Switching to boost mode also doesn't have much of an impact. So here we're looking at the boost mode on the Pro, and well, performance drops are still occurring. It's kind of unusual as normally boost mode can be used to smooth over the frame rates, but in this case, the option does very little in terms of improving the performance, which is quite strange. And yeah, if you're wondering, I did double check by resetting the machine and turning it off, just to be sure from a clear boot that boost mode was properly enabled. But yeah, these are the results. When it comes down to getting the best experience on PlayStation 4 then, I think it's safe to say that base hardware does the job just fine, and with PlayStation 4 Pro you're really not getting any benefit. Considering the game was released just around the time when PlayStation 4 Pro debuted, maybe a patch just wasn't on the agenda. Thankfully the base version holds up quite nicely, and whether you choose to play on PS4 or the Nintendo Switch, I think the game is replicated really well across both systems. And in many respects I actually find that the Switch version has the potential to be the best way to play the game just because of the portable nature of the console. Although if you're going to be playing mostly at home, then yeah, PS4 version is the way to go there. Anyway, with that said, I think I'll leave it there. I hope you've enjoyed our look at Dragon Quest Builders, and if you have, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe. Oh, and don't forget to check out our Patreon page at digitalfoundry.net as well, where you'll be able to download a high quality version of this source file, which better shows off the benefits of running at 60 frames per second. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Ah!